The views and opinions expressed by A Little Bit Culty are those of the hosts and don't reflect the official policy or position of the podcast. Any of the, quote, fire content provided by our guests, bloggers, sponsors, or authors are the opinion and are not intended to malign a religion, a group, a club, an organization, business individual, anyone or anything, unless, Sarah?
You're a douchebag.
Yeah. We're not doctors, psychologists, therapists, licensed counselors, or shamans, even though you kind of think you are sometimes.
I'm like an urban shaman. Okay. Good talk. Hey, everybody. Sarah Edmondson here.
And I'm Anthony Ames, a.k.a. Nippy, Sarah's husband, and you're listening to
A Little Bit Culty,
a.k.a. ALBC, a podcast about what happens when devotion goes to the dark side.
We've been there and back again. A little about us. True story. We met and fell in love in a cult. And then we woke up and got the hell out of Dodge.
And the whole thing was captured in the HBO docuseries The Vow, now in its second season.
I also wrote about our experience in my memoir, Scarred, the true story of how I escaped NXIVM, the cult that bound my life.
Look at us, a couple of married podcasters who just happen to have a weekly date night where we interview experts and advocates in things like cult awareness and mind control.
Wait. This does not count toward date night, babe. We got to schedule that. That's separate.
So there's 2 days we got to hang out?
We do this podcast thing because we learned a lot on our exit ramp out of NXIVM, still on that journey, and we want to pay the lessons forward with the help of other cult survivors and whistleblowers.
We know all too well that culty things happen. It happens to people every day across every walk of life. So join us each week to tackle these culty dynamics, everywhere from online dating to mega churches and multi-level marketing.
This stuff really is everywhere. The cultiverse just keeps on expanding, and so are we. Welcome to Season 5 of A Little Bit Culty, serving cult content and word salads weekly on your favorite podcast platforms. Learn more at alittlebitculty.com.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to it, my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of A Little Bit Culty.
Yeah, I just had a little violent clearing of the throat before we started here.
You all right?
Like granola. It's doing its thing.
It's a real culprit. Well, we just got back from a little mini trip over Troy spring break to Savannah, Georgia.
It was pretty amazing. If you haven't been to Savannah, I highly suggest you go. Don't drive back to Atlanta and hit rush hour traffic in Atlanta.
That was not fun. But the rest of the trip was really fun.
It was perfect
It
up
was
until
perfect.
that point.
Ever since we moved to Atlanta, people have been like, oh, you have to go to Savannah. I was like, okay, Savannah, I get it. Sounds great. And then we decided to go for spring break. And I actually didn't look it up. I didn't have any image in my mind of why Savannah was so
I'm glad
beautiful.
you didn't. I'm glad you didn't.
I'm glad. It was
it
like a
hit you
surprise.
that.
It's like you're watching a trailer of a movie before you go see it.
Right.
So it was
What
really.
did you think?
Honestly, I knew it was historic. So I knew there was, that's all I really knew. Like there's a lot of history there. But
Yeah.
for people who haven't been, like picture the architecture and the history and the old world feeling of being in Europe and England and France.
Well, what did you think?
Oh, what did I think?
You think it was like trail hitches and beaches?
What was really like surprising also, in addition to the incredible food and the history and the architecture and the moss coming from the trees. What's it called?
Spanish moss.
Spanish moss.
Which
Like it's
is
so
neither Spanish nor moss.
wow. But it was very romantic. It was. I'd love to go back just
Fair,
with you
fine,
too.
fair
Although I had a
enough.
great time with the
But
kids.
it's not called romantic moss. It's called Spanish moss.
Okay. But we almost every day ran into
It was nuts. Just when I thought it was over.
we ran into random
Yeah.
people who knew the podcast or saw
But
the Vow.
like, listen, I think I'm somewhat indifferent to that.
Mhm.
I always appreciate when someone comes up and says something. I like that. And they're always very humble and like grateful when they do it. And never has it been intrusive. So it's always been positive. But we're talking like random, like there's a truck. What was it called? The food truck
The
circle?
Starlin Yard food trucks, which by the way, if you go to
And
Savannah,
the
you have
person
to
at
go.
the cash register recognized us.
Yeah, she
like
do
it's
look
like
familiar. It's Sarah Kay. Actually, there was 2 Sarahs in Savannah who ended up being our sort of tour guides as we got there. That was amazing. She was the cashier.
the other Jewish Sarah in Georgia.
There's 2 Jewish Sarahs.
In
apparently.
Georgia now. And she gave us the download and
Gave
the
us the
history. She was
download.
great. She actually told us about the trucks.
We gave her a Little Bit Culty hat. We ran into Melanie McLeod from Boston on the street, who also gave us a bunch of tips. I love when I go to a new city, I love finding out what like the locals like and what's the city known for? What are the specialties beyond the tourist traps, like.
And you're very good at that.
Thank you. I know you also find it a little bit annoying.
No. I mean, tacitly in my head, I'm judging you.
But you also appreciate when I take you to the best coffee shop.
Yes.
Not like Starbucks.
And by the
do
way,
that. What?
the Mexican mocha.
The Mexican mocha from Foxy
I had 2 of
Loxy.
them with 4 shots in it. I'm not a big coffee guy.
Okay.
And then on the car ride back, you're calling an acting studio to book me an audition.
That was crazy.
Because Sarah plays great secretary while I'm driving in traffic. It's NASCAR out there.
It really is.
Anyway, point is she goes, Anthony Ames, and there's a little pause. And the woman says,
"Is this Sarah?" And I go,
oh
"Yes,
my God.
is this Sarah?" She's like, I've been following her podcast. I got out and she told us a little bit about her cult. Cannot wait to meet her. I'm not going to say her name because I don't know how public she is, but it's just been crazy. Like the reach of this podcast, and we're super appreciative.
But this is like universe stuff, right?
It is universe
Remember
stuff.
so I'll share with my audience. I was like, I think I told you I had about 6 months to a year of doing this. I just don't like it's hard for me to be on the other end of and be emotionally engaged all the time with some of our guests. And I told myself, if I ever felt that, I got to like pivot in something, And then just to go out the very week I'm thinking that and have this experience, it's just positive what we're doing. And I think
it's like positive reinforcement.
It reminded me of like, why do this in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a lane and a platform to help people, you have to take it, I think. You don't have to, but I think it's a great thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I got a little more reinvigorated as to why we were doing what we're doing. And I was like, are we going to do acting? I put the question in the universe. Then I get an audition. You get a voiceover. So it's like, keep doing what you're doing.
Keep doing it. Keep acting. Keep with the podcast.
It was me just being aligned with the universe.
Are you aligned with the universe?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're aligned with the universe. And it's not a hard segue to talk about the fact that we even have a podcast thanks to our guest today.
Kind of laid that up for you there.
Yeah, you set it up for me. Our guest is a very special person in our lives.
Why is he special, sir?
Well, he's actually a member of the Little Bit Culty team.
He's the heartbeat, you might say. The think tank?
Some of you may have heard this in other episodes. We did the vow. Our lives kind of blew up in this weird way. And then his wife, Karis, actually reached out to us and said, you should do a podcast.
And I was like,
no, I'm done talking about it.
I'm done.
What was
do
that
you have
voice?
imitation of me?
No, wait.
No.
Oh, no. Fuck this. I'm done. Fuck this. Tell my story. Whoa.
And he talked me into it. Will was like...
We were both skeptical.
Yeah. But you were like more open
I was
than
more
I
like,
was.
tell me why.
And I was kind of like, all right, Will, give me a reason to do it. And he was like, boom, 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 boom. You have a platform. Your story's done this and this. And I was like...
And he's now our
kind of
production
hard to
partner.
argue that.
Now he's our production partner and sound partner and the co-founder and lead producer over at Citizens of Sound, which he runs with his wife, Karis, in order to produce shows that make a difference.
But the real question is, why is Will our guest today, Sarah?
That is the real question. And he grew up in the Evangelical Church, specifically the Word of Faith, which he now calls A Little Bit Culty.
Dare I say. He became a worship leader during the years between high school and his mid-20s, eventually evolving into an Episcopalian, which was his favorite version of Christianity.
Reminder, there's no shortage of different types of Christianity. He almost became an Episcopal priest, released worship albums within the Christian music industry, and even went on 15 missionary trips preaching the gospel to people in order to save them. Zambia, India, Romania, Honduras, practically you name it. Will's probably been there teaching them about God, or one version of God anyway.
And eventually he moved from New York City back to Tulsa, where he was from, and decided to leave his aspirations of priesthood behind. Thank God he did. Should I thank God that he did?
I don't know.
Well, I am.
That's what we're here to talk about. Why did he do all that? And without further ado, our dear friend,
Sir William
Rutherford. Will Rutherford, this has been 2 years in the making, at least.
Hi, guys.
Hi, welcome to A
He's
Little Bit
made a
Culty.
podcast. He's made a podcast in the meantime.
Welcome to the podcast
I'm so happy to be here.
that you initiated. This is amazing.
All right, Will, are you familiar with our format?
You guys talk about cults and stuff like that?
So what we like to do is we start with how you got in. No, actually, in all seriousness, it really is a special episode because you, our guest today, I'll tell you, dear listeners, is not only a member of the Little Bit Culty team, but he's our production partner. He's our sound producer. He's the co-founder and lead producer at Citizens of Sound, which he runs with his wife, Karis, in order to produce shows that make a difference. So why is he our guest today? Well, he's our guest because just over 2 years ago, Will and Karis slid into my DMs, I believe it was mine, and was like, you all should do a podcast. Like, we loved The Vow and you should do a podcast. And I think the conversation was, appreciate that, but like, I'm pretty sure The Vow put it all out there and we're done. But like, it was COVID, so we entertained a phone call with Karis, right?
Mm-hmm.
You should find those emails and post them.
Maybe we will. But how involved were you at that stage?
So this was the pandemic, and we were watching a lot of TV, and we were, like a lot of people, trying to figure out, what the hell are we going to do? Are we going to survive? Is this going to go like The Last of Us style, or are we going to regulate and everything's going to be okay? So we were in the process of starting our podcast business, and we were watching The Vow. And I remember 2 episodes in, I was like, I mean, so far, this doesn't seem that bad. I mean, because it was very comfortable language and even kind of familiar language that I was used to kind of growing up in the church and stuff. And then by the time we got to the end of it, we were like, what the fuck? And we definitely related in a lot of ways just from our upbringing. And so while we were starting our business, we were sliding into a lot of DMs being like, hi, how's the pandemic treating you? Are you surviving? Well, are you interested in podcasts? We would write people like on Instagram who were influencers who had a story.
Interesting.
And that's kind of how we got it started. And so Karis was like, I feel like I want to write Sarah. I think there could be a podcast about cults that they could do. So I remember we were specifically really liked you and Nippy on the show, and you guys had really fun personalities. So that was Karis's stepping out, and then that led to a date on Zoom. Nippy wasn't sure how he felt about me yet, and then the rest is history.
It was more about, I was fucking done. Like, I didn't want to talk about it. I felt like if we were going to move on with our lives from this, like, podcast wasn't the way to do it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then,
Sorry about that.
well,
Sorry about
we
that.
got pitched the idea by Jess.
Will and Karis pitched the idea, and
The
then
idea,
we put it
no,
out
then-
on the Instagram.
On the Instagram.
On the Instagram, we said, who wants to hear more? And so many people did. And that's when Jess reached out with the title, A Little Bit Culty. And then,
Oh, that's right. Yeah, Sarah, you put out a note, like,
Yeah.
you're like, who would be interested in a podcast? And then I guess apparently you got a whole bunch of
Right.
responses being like, please,
whole
please,
bunch.
please.
and everybody said, yes, totally do it. Except one person said no. It was like one of those polls on Instagram stories. And the one person who said no was Sandra, our incredible, like, very part-time assistant, who does all sorts of other things. And I was like, why no? She's like, because you're so busy. Like, when are you possibly going to have time? And every now and then I message her. I'm like, Sandra, I'm drowning. Can you please, like, file my taxes? Or-
She's helped us a lot.
She's like, I told you so.
She's totally right.
Once Jess pitched that season, and then I was like, I could kind of see it. And then it was my conversation with you. And I was like, okay, I know why I wouldn't do it. And you're like, why should I? And you were like, there's more to hear. You're helping people. And I was like, and we don't have to do anything except
Well,
put a mic in our room during COVID.
but one of the things you said to me right from the beginning is we're having these conversations anyway,
right.
right?
That's
Like,
true.
we were talking to Yanya Lalich and Stephen Hassan and Dan Shaw. Like, why not record them and share them? I'm so glad that you and Karis reached out. But I'm curious, when you were watching The Vow, we're kind of like working backwards here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, had you already kind of deprogrammed from your culty, and we're going to call it evangelical, specifically Word of Faith, right? Which you grew up in?
Yeah. And I kind of had left the Word of Faith movement a long time ago,
Okay.
but I was still recently fresh out of the church. But I had officially what maybe you'd call finished my deprogramming or my deconstruction. And it happened, coincidentally, same time as the pandemic. While the world is having a crisis, I was kind of having my personal existential crisis, being like, I woke up one morning and I was like, it's all gone. It's all gone. Everything that was attached to me, that was in my brain, that I felt like I was a slave to or I couldn't get away from, was
Wow.
just completely gone. So it was interesting. Yeah, watching The Vow was almost like watching a memory more than like relating in real time. It was more like, I remember feeling those feelings. I
Right.
remember people like that. I remember buzzwords like that. I remember. And so, yeah, I'm definitely in a more of a reflective place on all of it now, but I was still decently fresh out of the womb,
Right.
I guess you could say, in a metaphoric type way.
Well, for those who don't know, I mean, we've touched on evangelical Christianity, but let's just go back. Were you born into it? Were your parents evangelical?
Yeah, I was born into it. And Evangelical is more of an adjective than it is a denomination. So it's more like a type of Christian. So you can have evangelical type Catholics or Episcopals or Methodists or non-denominational type church people.
I didn't know that. What does that mean then? Like proselytizing?
Basically,
Okay.
it's the mission of sharing the good news, sharing the gospel, and it's the idea of evangelizing and sharing the Bible and God with everybody that you come in contact with.
It's kind of evangelical of everything then.
It's free advertising.
Yeah.
It's like a practice. Yeah, it's a large pool. And then what's interesting is within like the Christian world, it's kind of like music, that there are so many different types of subgenres. Literally, you can have one instrument in this album and that makes it a specific subgenre. Like makes it a little jazzy, or if in electronic music, you have electronica or trap. Like religion's almost the same way, where there's so many different types of Christian groups that have formed, that have broke off, that have split, that have gone this way and that have gone that way based off of maybe a very small difference or maybe a large difference. Even like the Episcopal Church is known for being pro-woman and pro-queer, but there was a break-off one called ACNA that is not pro-women and not pro-queer. So there's so many different versions of Christianity.
How do you know? Like, is there like a Wikipedia page? Like, how do people know when they're signing up what they're getting into? Like, am I going to be okay here if I'm gay or like not? Or like, is it just word of mouth? Like, is it written down somewhere? Excuse my ignorance.
I mean, a lot of churches in their about sections on their churches will say the most important thing to look for is like, what type of denomination is this church? Because a lot of churches now will be like, we are Synergy Church and we're just about the gospel, and it's very watered down, but you don't know what type of church it is. So you have to go digging and you're like, oh, this actually is a Baptist church. Oh, now I know that their doctrine is probably going to be a little bit fundamental, even though they might be portraying themselves as fresh, young, free, hip, cool. Oh, but if you look in the about section, they come from Baptist roots, or they're still
Which
a
means
Baptist
what?
church. So I don't know all the tenets of Baptism. Again, there's so many.
Give us a history of the theology of the Baptist church.
No, I really don't want to shit on Baptists
No.
because there are good Baptists and we might even have Baptist listeners, but traditionally there are a lot more fundamental type beliefs in like Baptist doctrine, like no drinking and, not queer affirming, stuff like that. So at least Southern Baptists are known for that. There's a lot of subgenres.
And that was Eric Skwarczynski from Preacher Boys was International Fundamentalist Baptist, which was very extreme.
Yeah. So that's another subgenre of that group, right?
Got it.
Are they all extreme? Are there any that don't have like some of the culty tenets that we've been discussing? Or do they all kind of get that way? Or some just kind of come and go? Or like,
We can back up a little bit more. Like, I want to be clear that this isn't really an anti-religious
No.
talk, because
right, no.
like religion can be a very, very good thing. Unfortunately, there are a lot of culty things within religion and specific churches. And because there are places of power within the church, it's very easy access for an abuser or a narcissist to find their footing or find a place in. So there are lots of beautiful, great, life-giving churches
Absolutely.
that promote peace, that promote a life of love.
Community.
Yeah, community and non-judgmental. But then on the flip side, there's the complete opposite, like a control environment. This is the only way to see the world, to believe in life.
Right.
And then where that evangelical gets his bad rap is really from like that urgency of Jesus could come back any day and we have to save his people. So therefore we're going to go and spread the word and tell everybody that they're wrong and that we're right and they shouldn't do that when they should do this, and they need to repent and follow Jesus. And often being like, following Jesus might be that specific group's interpretation of what Jesus is or what those beliefs are or what you should be doing or thinking about the world. So you have all these groups competing with saving everybody with completely different ideologies of what God actually means or what eternity actually means.
I'll echo your point just for any listener who hasn't been listening from the beginning of episode 1. Now we're almost at 90, that Nippy and I are not shitting on religion. If you're in a community, in a group that's healthy and you're happy and you're not being coerced or manipulated, or there's no charismatic leader, or all these things, all these points that we've taught along the way, stay in your group. We're just giving you tools to look at your church in this case and see if it's a healthy, safe place for you to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you grew up in Word of Faith. What was that about? Yeah.
Yeah. And that really belongs to the denomination called Pentecostalism.
So what does that mean?
This is a Protestant denomination or non-denomination. And it really emphasizes the direct personal experience to God through like the Holy Spirit. And kind of this idea of like, you believe in God, but then receiving his Spirit means that you have the gifts of the Spirit, that you are like a full Christian, that you are highly blessed, and that you can be financially blessed, you can be healthy, live a full life of relationships and purity. And this kind of idea in Pentecostalism is also that the Bible, the inerrancy of the Bible, which means it's without error. So like the book is completely perfect and there's no contradictions in it. There's no errors at all. It's completely perfect, almost as of a God itself. So you can read like a piece of the text that is obviously 2,000 years old when there was actually slavery was like legal, right? But people still look at those verses and be like, yeah, but you know, that verse still says X, Y, and Z. So a lot of people get hung up on obviously the idea of like, it's dated. It can still be meaningful, have some good stuff in it, but you can't be so literal with something that was like 2,000 years old. So Pentecostalism holds onto the Bible as like absolute truth. Don't drift from the Bible. Pentecostalism talks about the idea of new birth. So if you haven't been born again, repented, and asked Jesus into your heart, then you are currently on a pathway to hell where you will live eternity in this like fiery, burning place of torture because you never accepted Jesus. So those are like two really big fundamental beliefs within the Pentecostal church. And where evangelicalism comes from is the idea of like the second coming of Jesus Christ could happen any day. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen 10 years from now. So we always have to be ready and be preaching the gospel and talking to everybody about Jesus, making sure they're not going to hell. Or you're not really a Christian, or you're not really a believer because you're not evangelizing. So this whole way of thinking and this whole way of life is kind of broken down into its doctrine. And a lot of those churches won't drift on their doctrine, but you'll have different types of leaders and different types of churches who manifest that doctrine. And some of them are like safe people. They're not really mean, bad people trying to hurt anybody, but their whole entire view of reality and the way that the world is kind of based on that like mindset. So naturally, you just kind of get this us versus them judgment thing from actual good people who think they're doing right and think that they are doing their best and they're just loving people and loving God. And at the same time, you also have power abusers and narcissists using that same theology and taking advantage of people and spiritually abusing people. And those churches could be literally next door to each other doing the same thing, but one is more harmful than the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah. When people save people, what do they like? Do they get gold stars? Do they get trophies? Do they like?
Sarah just wants to know how to enterprise this, you know?
Yeah.
Oh my God! Do I get a stripe on my sash?
How do I get
what
my
do I
star?
get?
Yeah. I believe an angel comes down and gives you a sash and you can put it in your collection. It's something like that. No, there are people that believe the more good you do, the more souls you save. There's like some sort of eternity crown that does
I knew it.
actually get jewels.
I knew
Yeah,
it.
that does actually have jewels on it that you will experience on the other side of life. You'll get that crown.
It's that kind of shit that motivates me. So I get it.
It's like Thanos.
the infinity crown, infinity stones.
So it sounds like each sect or each church is dependent on the leader at the time. Is that fair?
In a lot of ways, because again, religion is based off of like symbolism and symbolizing God and using Jesus as a symbol of God, which I think could be helpful and okay for people to do. Like, I'm not going to tell people not to do that. If you want to do that, that's a beautiful personal belief. But I think the problem with that is because a lot of people have the symbolized God that's really only found in like a book or in their imagination in some ways. Leaders of church almost, and this is where like priests come in, they stand as like the representation of God. And there are a lot of priests who do that in a really good way where they're like, I'm obviously not God, but I'm just going to be a symbol for you and read from this book about peace and love and hope that you can like find some meaning in it. And then there are other people who are like, yeah, I kind of am God. It kind of goes to their head where they kind of become that leader. And then like people do, like you've seen, they latch on to those leaders as if like, well, Pastor Jerry or Pastor so-and-so, whatever they say, they look at them as almost the mini God on earth. If they don't have anyone to follow, it's that person they're following, right? So if you ever have seen The Righteous Gemstones on HBO, so speaking of Word of Faith movement, The Righteous Gemstones, it is the closest thing depicted on screen of what that movement in culture is like in a lot of ways. Like I said, not everybody is an asshole and corrupt, but a lot of the performance, and there's like a bishop type guy, the main leader, and there's a lot of scandal that's always being covered up because it's a business, and if the business goes under, then everyone loses their money.
Right.
So a lot of that is true.
And that amount of money?
The one I grew up in is like multi-million-dollar like nonprofit.
Mega church?
Mega church, yeah.
So where does all the money go?
I mean, it's production. I mean, so basically, like the church I grew up in probably had like 3,000 people. And so there's staff, there's obviously the pastor. They do good things, like they do food outreaches, they do things for the city where they're putting money in there. But also there's a lot of money that no one has any idea where it's going. Like it's kind of a mystery.
What were you going to say about Danny?
Oh yeah, he was inspired by his mother being taken advantage of by a Word of Faith church. And that's what inspired him to make the show, which is I found very interesting.
Well, did you just assign homework?
So go watch Righteous Gemstones.
Yeah,
It's a little bit crass, but it's really funny and really niche.
It's really funny.
It is definitely niche, but it came to us at a time where I think we were, again, trying to take a break from the cult content. And then we watched that. And it was perfect, actually, because it was definitely a little bit culty, but also hilarious. And
So
probably
good.
the only show I'd consider acting on, or White Lotus.
Yeah, you could be like Judy's like cousin or something. It could be really funny.
I would totally be Judy's cousin. I would do anything. I'd be an extra on that show.
It's got a great cast, too.
Let it be known. It's got a great
John
cast.
Goodman, yeah.
John Goodman.
So
it.
funny.
Goggins, he's worked with Tarantino a few times. He's from Georgia. So is Danny McBride.
Oh, that's right.
They're both from Georgia.
But those churches exist now and thrive.
Right.
Sarah, I bet we could go drive in a 2 to 3 mile radius right now and find a couple.
You could, especially your guys are in Atlanta, Georgia, for sure.
Yeah.
There's actually one right near
Right
us.
down the
that
street.
I thought it was a furniture store. And then I was like, I was with Sarah the other day. She was driving me around. I'm like, what's all this traffic? She's like, it's church track. It was a mega church. I'm like, at that furniture store? It was like some PGA golf thing that they turned into a mega church. It was crazy to hire like traffic cops to navigate all the extra.
Sunday's nuts, yeah.
So
Do you think we could infiltrate?
you guys could at least do like a docu-series and go in there undercover and record some stuff.
We can do it in our spare time. We just walk like a couple
Do you
miles.
think that we need costumes? Like, what do you wear? What do you wear to a Word of Faith church service? Is it similar to what's in a Righteous Gemstones? You have to dress up?
You wear a big smile and say y'all, Sarah. I bet you can do it.
Hi, y'all.
Well, yeah, again,
you go.
there is
You're
like
in.
the
Like that?
whole like Sunday's best. So like there's a big drive on like, go at least one tier up on Sunday morning to show respect. But there is like a big cultural move of come as you are if you want to come in joggers. It just really depends on the culture of the church and
Right, of
and
the
how
church.
like strict they are, right? So one thing I want to say about what was different about the Word of Faith movement. Again, it's a Word of Faith movement within the Pentecostal denomination. So not all Pentecostals are really a part of this movement specifically, but this specific movement is Word of Faith because everything is based off of your belief and how much you believe.
Okay.
And if you believe enough, kind of this name it, claim it mentality, if you believe enough, then you can be rich. If you believe enough, then you can get out of the wheelchair. If you believe enough, then X, Y, and Z, you can get that job promotion. There's like all these ideas of belief being the main thing you need to have. And if you don't get any of those things, then perhaps you don't believe enough, or there's something holding you back in your belief in Jesus. Or have you tithed recently? Have you been giving money to the church? That could be why you're not
Right.
seeing any results. So this kind of teaching would start to like spread that way. And I saw it really harm a lot of people. I really did.
So I see two things. It's like toxic manifesting
Mhm.
and makes it really ripe for abuse. Because if you don't have the thing that you want, then it's just because you are not believing.
And when it works, guess who caused it to work?
Well, Jesus.
Or pastor, right?
Oh, the pastor. Right. Well, you've been editing this show since the beginning, so long enough to know that pretty much every group has somebody who's like, okay, so I talked to God And here's the deal.
Yeah, I know.
It's such a like obvious red flag for someone who's not religious. But if you are religious and you're buying into this person is the voice of God or representing God, then why wouldn't you believe?
Exactly. And there's that whole concept of sheep. And this is not to like shit on people, but the concept of sheep is often people stop thinking critically at some level and they accept like a surface value and then they just start to follow. They just listen to what a leader in power says, or they just listen to their friends, or what is the crowd doing? So there's always a large percentage of people in the sense of like sheep mentality where they have stopped thinking critically about what they actually believe and what they're saying and how this is affecting their everyday life and what these tenets mean. And so you do have like these big mega churches that, and sometimes they aren't pushing really hard on those tenets. They try to stay surface level for a period of time. They make people feel comfortable and feel like everything is good and dandy. And like the deeper you get into it, kind of like cults, I'm not calling it a cult, I'm calling it a little bit culty. You start to see the problematic issues the deeper you get into that kind of doctrine and that mindset.
Before you share some of those problems, what was your role? Like, tell us about your childhood. And like, I know you got into production and like music and things like that. Was that in Word of Faith?
Yeah. So I grew up in the Word of Faith church. And then I went to, at the same time, I went to a evangelical charismatic high school.
Ooh.
It wasn't Pentecostal, but they could coexist in the same church universe. Like they were friends. The pastors would shake each other's hand if they saw each other at the restaurant, but they're on opposite sides of town and they have both large followings. So I kind of was a part of like these two gigantic muscles of Tulsa, these church muscles. And the difference in my high school was more evangelical in the sense like they did mission trips every year and it was all about preaching the good news. And we're not going to go super deep into the idea of the spirit or the name it, claim it stuff. But the most important thing is sharing the gospel and getting people saved. So I grew up at church in this thing. And then I grew up in a high school like this. And I was a musician. So what I did was I got involved in my youth bands at my church and at my high school because it was a Christian high school. So there's chapel. So I'm being developed as a worship leader, which is basically the person who leads the songs. If you go to church, there's a song leader, someone singing on a mic, on a guitar, like, leading the clapping.
A lot of that?
Yeah. So I was becoming a worship leader throughout my whole entire high school upbringing.
Did you know that? Or was that that was something you were aspiring to be?
It was something I was aspiring to be because I wasn't athletic. And because I grew up in that culture, I didn't really think of any other professions outside of doing the work for Jesus. So I was like, well, I'm a musician. So I guess this is my natural path. And on top of that, you have like prophets, these guys that would come in. They're like basically friends of the pastor who have like a traveling ministry. They'll drop in, they'll say some profound stuff, they'll pray for people, and then they'll like find random people and then they'll start. Maybe they have a real feeling and they can sense it through energy, or it's bullshit. I don't know, one of the two, probably both but they would look at people and they would start saying, you need to leave that abuser, or you're supposed to be a preacher one day, or would start prophesying over people. And then so you take these words as like, oh, this man just heard from God, and I just had an emotional experience with God speaking through this guy. And so growing up, I had so many prophets look at me and be like, you're going to be a song leader of the nations. Thousands are going to hear your music. So I also grew up with this idea of like, man, I have a purpose to like live out. I have a path created for me, given by God.
What a bonus. As we've talked about, there's always good. I think that's a good thing for a kid to have.
Well, it depends who's deciding it.
I mean, in this
Do you know
case, it
what I
worked
mean?
out well for Will.
Yeah, I mean, I actually look back on my childhood and I don't really think of myself as a survivor. I actually had a pretty good upbringing. What I saw that I lacked was, I grew up with a natural us versus them mentality. This is the only way in which to understand the universe and understand God, and everybody else is wrong. So I grew up in a bubble, but like I didn't have any specific abusers at the time. I had a lot of friends. I would always sneak and make out with the pastor's daughter in youth group. Like I was like having
That a boy will.
I was like I was running around having fun in my little circle, but it was more like coming out of that in college and beginning deconstruction and actually starting to critically think about my whole life at that point. I was looking back and being like, some of that thinking is kind of fucked up. And I can't believe that I thought that way for a long time. And there's other Christians that believe different things and they're actually Christians. And there's other people in the world that are good. It was just like a little bit at a time. I was like, oh, it was almost like it happened to me versus I was seeking out an escape. I just slowly started to wake up over a long period of time, being in it for so long.
Anything in particular that started that, or
What would you
just
challenge?
being?
We'd love to hear that.
So for one, I had really good parents. My mom, I give it to her because she was saved in prison and she was like a drug dealer and she found Jesus while she was in jail.
What?
Yeah,
I don't know this
she
story.
found Jesus while she was in jail. So when she left jail, she got her son back and basically committed her whole life to the religion. And she was always a really good mom. And so I've never really tried to push on her that hard for her beliefs. I'm like, you know what? You had a really hard like first 20 years of life and I'm just going to let you have it. And we're just not going to talk religion at the dinner table. It's kind of like don't talk politics at the dinner table. I just don't like to talk religion.
That's fair.
I would go to my mom's and my dad's every other weekends. They were divorced. And my dad was a lot more loose. Like he loved cigarettes, he drank, he had friends over. And so I kind of lived a duo life growing up. I was like, I'm really, really Christian on this weekend with my mom. And on this weekend, I'm like sneaking some alcohol and watching rated R movies and like staying up late. And so in some ways, I felt like I was like balanced within the bubble. That then conditioned me to whenever I finally started to think critically and get challenged by authors and podcasters and artists, and especially in college, being around other people who are studying theology or studying philosophy and starting to get challenged in your thinking, I was almost conditioned to be just open to a different way of thinking about things. And so it was almost like I slowly started to dust one little piece off at a time as I started to expand my thinking in college through authors, artists, critical thinkers, even other theologians in a different type of Christianity. I was like, I've never heard of the gospel or Jesus explained in that way before. That's interesting. Oh, like, so even like my own faith, thinking about different versions of faith was a helpful step to start breaking off some of the word of faith doctrine that I was living by.
This is the golden age of cult recovery. The more we speak up and share our stories, the more we realize we are not alone. Your voice and your story can empower others. This is Sarah, and I'm proud to be a founding collaborator of the #IGotOut movement. Learn more at igotout.org. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga. Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like I'm in Vancouver right now and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. #cold pools, #crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it. And I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty.
Meals bring people together, but for many families, providing their next meal can be a challenge. You can help by participating in Macy's annual Feeding the Hungry food drive. All proceeds go toward local food banks and families. Now through January 31st, you can purchase an icon in-store or online, or watch out for the blue Feeding the Hungry shelf tags, where a portion of your purchase will be donated to local pantries. Together, we can combat hunger in our local communities at Macy's.
Are you still in touch with people from that time that are still in? And is there kind of a division there? Or
You know, I've always been a social and relational person, and we moved back from New York about 5 years ago, and had been gone from Tulsa for over 6 and went straight from college to Charlotte, North Carolina, Tulsa. I'll get to more of that story later. When I came back, I reached out to some of my old friends from the Word of Faith movement and my childhood because we had a lot of memories and they were still in Tulsa. and had a couple like little small meetups, not really going into anything specific. And this really didn't show much of an interest to keep up with me. I think with the realization that our worldviews so different and polarizing that there really wasn't much in common anymore. In some ways, it was a natural breakup. But another like really good thing about where I come from is that I'm still best friends with some of the people I went to high school with. And we are all in the same place with faith, being like, we have no clue. We're not a part of that anymore. We have a bonding experience. And we joke like we escaped the cult together. You know, it's not that dramatic in a sense we escaped the cult together, but we at least escaped toxic thinking and a way of viewing the world and the universe that we kind of share in today that has kind of bonded us. Like in high school, we were going to Mexico and Honduras and Dominican on our spring breaks. And we would literally go to villages, like people are in impoverished areas, and we would do skits and we would sing songs. And we'd have all the people come up and we would pray over them. And then we would ask them to ask Jesus into their heart. And then we would get on a bus and then we would go and drive to the beach for the rest of the day. And I was like, this is weird. Why are we doing this? Why are these white kids going to like impoverished areas in Mexico and praying prayers and doing skits and then leaving and going to the beach? Like something feels really off about this. So it was more of those moments happening where you're like, I did that for so many years.
What were some of the other inconsistencies or things that were weird looking back or red flags now that you've spent 80 something episodes with Nippy and I?
Well, definitely the abusive leaders that I encountered along the way when we break down coercive control or narcissists. There's many that come to my mind. Again, my story is a little long and big, and so it's hard to go into each sect in a whole lot of detail. So definitely identifying specific leaders that I came across in that vein. And then, we did an episode with, I believe her name was Erin from the Wild Wild Country documentary. She wasn't in the documentary, but she came from the community. And if you remember that documentary, there's people just like flailing the arms and falling out and going wild. There were a lot of services like that in the name of the Holy Spirit. I remember being a kid and seeing my mom laughing and shaking on the ground and people running in the sanctuary, running in circles, some people slithering like snakes, pastors laying hands on pews and people falling out. And I remember like being fascinated by it. I think I would be fascinated by it today if I saw it. But also it was just wild and strange. And I remember feeling like I was experiencing something when I was in those moments. But looking back, it's just so weird. I remember bringing friends who weren't religious to those kind of service thinking they would like catch the ghost or catch the magic, and them being pushed away and writing off religion even more after going to a service like that. So my upbringing was a lot of weird supernatural experiences, thinking I saw people get out of wheelchairs. Maybe they did. But then, finding out there were some scandalous pastors that were planting people in the audience to kind of boost people's faith. So finding out that there was fraud going on amongst all these things. And then college got a little bit more interesting, not as much weirder, but as my critical thinking started to come into play, I started to be looking for weirdness more and more. Well, I mean, in college, you had a melting pot of people. And it's interesting because you have a lot of hardcore Christians, you have a lot of like anti-Christians. We had a lot of queer people who were hidden and underground because you couldn't be at our school or you get kicked out. So it was a real melting pot. So experiencing different types of Christianity, experiencing different types of thought, but under kind of this doctrine of the school of you must live by these ways or you're a sinner or you're getting kicked out. We would have some crazy people pass through. Like I remember one time I skipped chapel and I hid in my room with a friend and we just played video games or something. And then we got a notification from all of our friends who went to chapel saying, there is a crazy preacher in here right now. And the leaders are not allowing us to leave chapel. They're blocking the doors. They're saying we must stay. So there was a lot of force in the school's doctrine. You had to be really quiet about your unbelief or your questions about religion. And a lot of people did. I mean, us friends talked amongst ourselves, but you didn't often tell that to the chaplains or tell that to the administration. Again, they can't really keep a hard pulse on everyone's deconstruction, but if you were out drinking or if you were caught with the same sex, you could get suspended or expelled or go through some sort of therapy, repenting and getting right with God before you could go back to the school. So in college is where I saw a lot of doctrine attempting to be forced upon so many different people that had so many different beliefs, and it just didn't really work. And so having that kind of camaraderie to process, to deconstruct and unlearn together was really, really helpful. And from college is when I got married to Karis. Like Christians get married immediately, so you don't accidentally have sex before marriage. So you get married immediately. So we were child brides.
Wait, you guys were virgins with each other?
Yes, I'll have to make sure that she's okay with me saying that on the air, but
Accidentally.
So you became a worship leader, and when you were in college, and then you became an Episcopalian?
yeah, so that's jumping ahead a few more years after
Oh,
college.
okay. So you tell us
Okay.
the story.
So college, I was still becoming a worship leader. Like I was singing at some of the biggest churches in Tulsa. I was leading worship for chapel at Oral Roberts University. And so I was kind of branded as a worship leader at the time. And I was recording albums, putting music out there. And so I was kind of becoming what people call in like the worship world. It's like, I was never really a celebrity, but I was like starting to get known as like an artist in that space, and my music was starting to spread.
You're the Justin Bieber.
You could
You're
say
the
it.
Justin Bieber.
You
of-
could say
of
it.
the
No, I mean, there are
Pentecostal.
You were a big deal.
I mean, I really wasn't that big of a deal.
You're
There's
a
a
big
lot
deal.
more bigger deal worship leaders than I was.
That's what Justin Bieber said.
I just want to know, what was your favorite song? Can you tell us?
Probably, I still love the song today. It's actually really good. It's called Beautiful Things by Michael Gungor, and it's good.
Can we play it?
I don't think that's legal. The song's like, you make beautiful things, you make beautiful things out of the dust. And it was a pretty cool indie hip band. So that was like what I was interested in. And what in a lot of ways started pulling me into different types of thinking, because a lot of the worship music was so cookie cutter and so annoying and bland. But then you had like some artists who would come out every now and then. Those kind of people really caught my ear for music. And I was like, I want to make music like this and be under people that think this way. And that just started to expose me more to different types of thinking. Like, does hell exist? Can gay people be a Christian? Like these really polarizing like ideas that like growing up, it was absolutely, I would have always thought hell existed and that you couldn't be gay. But then getting that permission from other Christians and other thinkers that like, you could still be a Christian and not believe in a hell. You can still be a Christian and be queer. You can like starting to think about that was the beginning of opening my mind to a different way of experiencing the universe. So
That's so good.
I kind of just pushed through college and got married to my lovely wife, Karis. And we immediately get hired at a church in North Carolina to a pretty toxic, narcissistic pastor at an evangelical church.
Oh,
So
no.
I go and start my whole life working for this institution that was starting to kind of walk away from, but it was all that I had prepared myself as a professional at that point. And it was the only way I actually knew how to make money was being a worship leader. So I moved me and my pregnant wife out to North Carolina, and we worked for a pretty toxic pastor who was, you know, he wasn't the worst in the world, but he was really not great. And it was not a good time.
What was your first sign that this was not a good situation?
Well, I found out like a couple months after moving there that this was a new church because he was just run out of his old church for activities unspoken, whatever the hell that meant. And then he was just so conceited and wanted to be the best thing in town. He even sent me and some of my team members to another church on a Saturday night, our time off, to write down notes at this other big church called Elevation, and wanted to know how they had it. And we needed to go back and bring the it to that church. And he was just very into himself. But I always tried to make relationships with the good people that had been around, even though he was not a great leader.
Interesting.
So when we continue the story, because it's just like a really weird like church spiritual journey, like of different types of churches. So that one had its roots in Presbyterianism, which there's a lot of Presbyterian type churches out east, southeast, where you kind of get the roots of Calvinism, which is a completely different type of Christianity. But the difference between that thinking is that suffering is a lot more involved in serving Jesus, and minimalism is a lot more involved. and there's not as much emphasis on like the Holy Spirit concepts, kind of the magical stuff. They kind of take some of the magical powers out of it, but then they get a little bit more intense with their doctrine and beliefs.
Militant.
Have you guys ever heard of Acts 29 or the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill?
I heard of it, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. In fact, we want to do a podcast about that.
I think that would be a good one because I don't really have time to get into that branch of Christianity today.
And we also didn't prepare you for that.
But that's another like toxic, really toxic, culty church group that was kind of revolving around this guy named Mark Driscoll. There's no proof that these people are narcissists, but if they check the boxes, it's guessed to assume they probably are. And a lot of people coming out of spiritual abuse with him. So I ended up getting a job at another church that was an Acts 29 church that followed Mark Driscoll's kind of method of living. And this is where I kind of started to actually experience like personal spiritual abuse. There was this certain leader I worked for was a very controlling person. He didn't want me to have friends outside of the church. He had talked about building a commune. He told Karis that it's fine that you're working, but just remember that your first job is being a wife and a mom. And there was a lot of red flags the way that he was treating people and controlling people and trying to control their lives. As a staff member, I'd watch him take one person out for coffee at a time and kind of break them down in the way that they lived and kind of convincing them to give up certain things or to follow him or the teachings or become a volunteer at the church. And so I saw him just kind of break down people. And then anyone that like pushed back, he ended up like running out of the church. And then one day the table was flipped on me where like I was pursuing music and I had a lot of friends, and he sat me down to do like a year review. And he was like, we're concerned about the relationships you're having outside of the church. We're unable to monitor what you're doing. We know that you're doing music. We ask that you submit that music under our leadership so that way we can review it and approve it before you're releasing it. And he started dropping all these things that he wanted me to change to be on staff for the next year. And I remember sitting there being like, oh my God. And in that moment, I looked at him and I was like, well, I am sorry to tell you this, but this is going to be our last month working here and we are going to be moving on.
Wow. So you just knew then?
Yeah. I was never really bought into that denomination or that style of thinking, but it was just the job I got. And I was kind of exploring it because it's a different way of thinking about faith and religion. But I immediately saw abuse and red flags within the leadership and then the type of thinking that these leaders were putting out through the Acts 29 system. So I was almost prepared to take a walk out the door when I had that meeting with him.
Had you and Karis already talked about it?
Yeah, she was struggling too. She's always been someone who's been like, I like faith for just surrendering to mystery, but I don't really buy into leaders or buy into doctrine. Like she's been very healthy with it the whole time and supporting me. So she was definitely ready to go. And so whenever I quit, that ends up leading me to another spiritual journey to New York City, where I get another church job at an Evangelical Church, but these were actually really good people and I really loved them. They were like pretty chill. And so when I was there, an old mentor of mine told me to go get my master's at this Episcopal seminary based off of kind of what my interests were. And I was really getting into the history of the church and wanting to understand more. So I ended up going to an Episcopal seminary and getting my master's and living on campus at General Theological Seminary in Chelsea, New York City, where half the students were queer. I was partying with my professors and I was just living the time of my life in the Episcopal Church. Very different experience.
Yeah.
Hey there, listener. Hope you're enjoying this episode and that you're remembering to hydrate, stretch, and unclench your jaws. Sometimes listening to conversations about heavy topics can really make you tighten up, you know? And remember, A Little Bit Culty loves you. Also, come hang out with us on Patreon after you finish this episode. It's fun over there. Fun is good. And now, here's a brief message from our sponsors.
The Frankies were a picture-perfect influencer family, but everything wasn't as it seemed.
I just had a 12-year-old boy show up here asking for help. He's emaciated. He's got tape around his legs. Ruby Frankie is his mom's name.
Infamous is covering Ruby Frankie, the world of Mormonism, and a secret therapy group that ruined lives. Listen to Infamous wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. What are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or never miss yoga.
Maybe it's getting 8 hours of sleep. I mean, that's my personal and everyone's dream, isn't it? Well, I definitely have some non-negotiables. Like, I'm in Vancouver right now, and I'm spending literally as much time as I can outside in nature. Hashtag cold pools, hashtag crushing it. Nature is a non-negotiable. Not enough time in the fresh air and the trees around me, and I start to feel not great, not myself, not grounded. Therapy day is a bit like my nature walks. I try to not miss it, and I know I'm just going to feel so much better all around if I make it a priority. I get so much out of it. It helps me put my worries and anxieties in their rightful place and helps me clear my mind so I can focus on what I really need and sometimes what I don't need. Like, I don't need to be overbooking myself just because I hate to say no to people. You know what I mean? Thanks, therapy. Thanks for helping me see that. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire and get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. Look, even when we know what makes us happy, it's hard to make time for it. But when you feel like you have no time for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. Never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/culty today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/culty. When did you leave there and come back to Tulsa? And where do you say you started your deconstruction?
So I would say like the whole time I'm just slowly brushing things off and putting in new things and pushing things out, putting in new things. So I felt like since college, I was always in the process of deconstructing and unlearning kind of from the word of faith Pentecostal mentality. But then I'm in my journey, I'm starting to pick up some other types of thinking, like within that, the Calvinist sphere, the Acts 29, like more militant doctrine. So while I'm kind of picking that up, I'm then moving that aside and pushing that over, and I'm walking over to this. So basically, I'm kind of exploring spirituality throughout my entire 20s and looking for what feels right, what seems right, what is truth, or is any of it true and everyone's just doing their best and I'm just going ahead and exploring all of them and seeing which one is right for me. So it was almost like I was deconstructing the whole time while I was learning and unlearning throughout the entire process. What I liked about the Episcopal seminary was it was a lot more like Buddhist in some ways, where there was so much more meditation, silence, rituals. There was an open door policy of really come as you are. There was women priests, queer priests. And so kind of when I was there, I was like, this actually feels like Jesus. This whole time I've been living my whole life trying to be like Jesus. And this is the first time that this actually kind of feels like Jesus.
That's so cool.
Yeah, Jesus actually talked about loving your neighbor as yourself, and he hung out with prostitutes and sinners, that what they say in the text. But anybody in the evangelical circles would be completely uncomfortable and turning those people away from the door. And now I'm over here in a completely different side of the world going like, oh, these people are actually loving everybody and accepting people in their doors as they are. And there is doctrine. Again, the Episcopal Church doesn't come without its own problems, but there's a lot more of a loose interpretation of doctrine, and they're more defined by their practices and like more like monastic lifestyles than they are what they actually believe.
The principles are leveraged rather than embodied, and it sounds like you found a place where they were more embodied rather than being leveraged.
And that makes sense too. Like, one thing that always kind of rubbed me the wrong way, and we may have mentioned this in a past episode, where that's such a blatant contradiction in, I guess, some branches of Christianity, not all, but like, Jesus loves you unless you're gay.
Right.
You know, and then in which case you're not welcome. And like, that makes no sense to me.
Well, it exposes the inconsistency of what they're pretending to stand for.
Yeah, so that's why I guess I felt like there was a pretense, there was a false inauthenticities. And just it's interesting also just from our own personal journey, because we're looking at different schools here and many of them are religious and everyone's like, but you'll be okay here because it's Episcopalian. I'm like, I don't even know what that means, but I'll go check it out. But now I know.
Yeah, well,
Thank you.
in the Episcopal Church, they read more from the scriptures than any other church I've ever been a part of. And so you'll hear a lot of people shitting on the Episcopal Church because they are so much more accepting of different types of people and different types of thought and different lifestyles. But like, they are reading scripture throughout the entire services, and it is really, really beautiful. And so it was my favorite church experience throughout my whole journey. But growing up from like as a baby and being a part of like the Bible Belt and becoming a worship leader in these mega churches and like going on like literally I went on like 15 mission trips like overseas doing this stuff, to like a very long unlearning experience and working for the church and having a really, really bad experience working for the church, and then landing at the Episcopal Church and getting my master's there and being like, this is great. This is beautiful.
So why'd you leave?
Well, so I finished my degree at the Episcopal Seminary. I get a job offer at an Episcopal church back in Tulsa. We leave New York City, very sad. We start our life over in Tulsa. And by the time I got there, I really loved the church and loved the leadership, but I had almost deconstructed my way out of faith completely by the time I got there. And I was so burnt out that I just felt like I couldn't give anymore. I began the application to become a priest, and I started checking off the boxes for the qualifications. And every time I tried to fill it out, I just could not fill it out. I couldn't do it. I did not want to live my life for the church or religion anymore. I got to the point where I just was done. I had been a worship leader for 15 years, and I really just didn't have any faith anymore. Even the Episcopal Church was beautiful and it was wonderful. I got so anti-doctrine in a lot of ways that I just didn't really see the purpose of, I guess, being labeled as a Christian, anymore. My wife is still a Christian, but really, like, she just loves liturgy and she loves to go to an Episcopal church when she can and take communion as the ritual. It's like more of like a practice of meditation. And I can do that and I can really get a lot out of it still today. But I don't have this label of being a Christian anymore. And also, I was just so exhausted. I just needed to leave that world. So I was mentioning in 2020, right? 2020 was kind of like my wake up. Like, I am no longer, it wasn't like I was trying not to be a Christian. I just woke up and I was like, I'm no longer a Christian anymore. Like, it's all just the thoughts, the feelings, the residue feels gone. And so it's almost like a clean slate where I can reset and I can now look at everything from a fresh perspective and go in with caution and decide to go in if and when I want to. And also, I know what to look for between like abusive leaders and toxic doctrine.
You better. Well, we've already talked about how, watching The Vow helped you put some pieces together and you reached out to us. And now you've sat through 80 plus episodes with us. How has what you've learned here affected your life? And has there been any stories where you've like been able to avoid other culty shit because of what you've learned in A Little Bit Culty? I
have so appreciated producing this show with you guys and Jess. And honestly, it's kept my spidey senses up, really, where I feel like in a lot of ways, I have no excuse to fall for a narcissist because I'm learning about them every single week. And I have my own experiences and I should be able to see one when I see one in the wild. Like, you know what I'm saying? Or people that are toxic and abusive. So I appreciate working on the show and hearing stories and being able to identify, I had an experience like that, or I remember somebody like that. I almost got involved with a podcast production, like a controversial, famous person. And halfway through, there was a lot of red flags, but in some ways I was chasing it, being like, this would be really good for my portfolio and my career. I saw red flags, but I was still chasing it because I was like, as long as I'm aware of the red flags, maybe I can still chase it. But as long as I know that there's red flags, like I was almost justifying it. And it like, we got to the end where even my agent was like, well, this is going to become a scam. You need to walk away. And I was like, oh, you're right. You're really right. I'm walking away. So yes, I have my own personal encounters. And then even within work, I'm able to identify when something is a red flag a lot more.
Well, obviously it's been a big career change, but how do you think your skill set as a worship leader affects what you're doing now as a podcast producer? Again,
in 2020, I was going through, I would say, my crisis of who am I now that I'm not that at all. And I spent 20 something years being that. My therapist really helped me walk through that process. She really came in clutch. And a lot of doing that was going back to like the youngest version of myself. Who are you before all this happened to you? Like, what were some of your desires, some of your wants, some of your needs? And I remember like going all the way back and being like, I always wanted to be in the entertainment industry. I always wanted to be even like TV and film. I always wanted to be in that. And so in some ways, recreating myself in 2020, I had already basically been out of the church for a few years, but I was still like in the process of when you exit something, you're in transition and you're figuring out your own ethics, your own morals, and you're also money and what you're going to do. But like it was 2020 where I felt really free of it and a restart, refresh, which is really helpful. So in that time is when we started our podcast business, and it really took off in 2020. I think naturally because I was a musician and I had like recording experience. I knew how to edit and produce music and produce vocals. And so it naturally led into what I could offer people. And in 2020, everybody wanted to start a podcast. Everybody was looking for new outlets to start their life or to get their voice out or connect with people. And so I'm really, really grateful for the pandemic and what it provided for me, even though I say that with sensitivity, knowing that it was probably one of the worst years for a lot of people. And so I don't take that lightly. But I also am at a place now where I can even look back on my religious upbringing and feel grateful and thankful for what it did and who it made me to be today. And it does come with like some baggage and some residue and some cynicism at times. But in a lot of ways, I feel like I have a healthy perspective. I can look back on religion and be like, religion can still be really good, but it can be bad with the wrong type of leader and the wrong type of thinking and creating that us versus them, they're right, we're wrong. Anytime that gets in the way, it starts to get tainted and distorted. But if you can use religion to connect to the mystery of the universe or to love on the inside of you, and you can experience that with a community, I think religion can be very healthy for people if done in a careful way.
I think so too.
I totally agree. I've seen it do both.
Maybe one day I'll dip my toe back in. The thing that really struck me as a like a little nugget that I hadn't seen before is the proselytizing in terms of saving, and saving people. And it's always irked me when there's people on the side, even like I was just walking this weekend on the Beltline and there was some people that said Jesus is Lord or their sweatshirts and they're handing things out. And I was like, no, thank you. I just left a cult. And I don't know if that helped or planted a seed in any way. Probably not. But I'm so allergic to it. But because, and I didn't really see this in this way before, we didn't say the word saving. We thought we were enrolling, AKA recruiting, which is saving. Like I was proselytizing.
Yeah, of course we were.
We were. I never would have used that word. We were evangelical personal development people, right?
That's what I related to, that it felt evangelical, like Nixium did.
Yeah.
Very evangelical.
And I never would have made that connection before. So that's wild.
You guys could probably walk into an evangelical non-denominational church in Georgia, and within the announcements, the language of the greeter and the pastor, they'll probably say so many buzz and trigger words that you probably heard in Nixium. Probably.
Yeah.
I bet.
It's sales.
Yeah.
It's really what it is. It's sales.
There's this quote by Richard Rohr. He is one of the authors that really helped me with my deconstructionism. And as part of my deconstruction, a natural evolution for Christians, they go from believing in heaven and hell to believing in no hell to believing in every single person on earth is going to go be with God one day. So like that's a part of a natural progression of you get rid of the bad idea that God would send people to hell. So you get rid of hell. And then you start to believe that if God exists and there is a heaven that exists, then everybody is going to be with God. Like that's the step in the right direction to start thinking healthy about a God. And so in the process, there's this guy, Richard Rohr, who was amongst a lot of Christians, very controversial. People think he's a heretic, and a lot of people are saying he saved my life. But anyways, he says this really well. Christians are usually sincere and well-intentioned people until you get to any real issues of ego, control, power, money, pleasure, and security. Then they tend to be pretty much like everybody else. We often give a bogus version of the gospel, some fast food religion without any deep transformation of the self. And the result has been the spiritual disaster of Christian countries that tend to be as consumer-oriented, proud, warlike, racist, class-conscious, and addictive as everyone else. And often more so.
Yeah.
And so I always thought like a really dangerous narcissist is a narcissist who's justified doing what he's doing and abusing people because of his faith or because of God.
Right.
And I think that can be really, really dangerous.
They hide behind that. You might appreciate this one, Will. Once a person accepts the premises upon which most religious identities are built, the withdrawal of his moral concern for those who do not share his premises follows quite naturally.
Love it.
You're either with me or
Jesus
you're not.
loves everybody
right?
except
I like what Alice Gretchen said on the podcast. She said that she's agnostic, but spiritually curious. And agnostic being like, I have no way to prove that there is or isn't a God. So you kind of stay neutral. But then staying spiritually curious, I think, is a really good way of living. Just kind of
I do too.
being open to the idea that there is a God and being okay with some people symbolizing that God through a practice. And I don't want people from here to think that like religion's bad and that they should question their religion. But I do think it's important to think critically about whatever religious practice you're doing or whatever church you belong to, because I think there could be some doctrine that's really dividing. It could be creating this natural us versus them mentality that you might be subconscious of, but you experience on the regular, like with friends or people out in public, but you don't know why you're reacting or thinking a certain way. Often there's like doctrine that is happening to us without knowing.
Mhm.
And then also blindly trusting a leader and not ever questioning and challenging that leader off what they're doing. And if you look at the actual teachings of Jesus, it's like almost too simple. Like if you actually read it, it's like you then can look at leaders or what your church or what your group is doing, and you're like, that's not what even the teachings of Jesus are talking about. You can quickly identify when it's not.
Yeah.
Is there any particular book that's been helpful in your deconstruction that you can recommend to people?
2 books. One's a religious book called The Universal Christ by Richard Rohr, which really expanded my idea of what God could be and think differently about that. And then also the book Sapiens. We've talked about this, Nippy.
Yeah.
But it was really helpful to read a book, like a historical book, in a really well-told narrative explaining like where we come from and how religion was created by man and how religion was used to actually, originally in good ways, but they talked about in the book how leaders of a village couldn't convince a community to move all of their stuff in their tents
Right.
if they knew there was a flood coming. So the only way that they could move them and survive is if they said, this tree god spoke to us and said, we must move uphill.
Right.
They found that villagers would often respond to, oh, tree god said, so okay, we're going to move, versus like man's word. And so the book Sapiens really like sealed the deal and was like, religion was man-made. And then I couldn't unsee religion not being man-made anymore. For a period of time, it ruined it for me until then I was able to go back in a healthy way through therapy, being like, okay, now I can see where religion can be helpful and done well.
Well, and also that wasn't the only tenet of religion, right? Religion had other spiritual aspects that it obviously fulfilled for a lot of people historically. It's just, we've never really had hierarchies that aren't vulnerable to abuses of power, and it's not proprietary to any domain, religion, cults, governments, school boards, what have you. There's always going to be a system in place that has tenets in it, and it's up to the people to go uphold them or leverage them. And religion is certainly one that's throughout time been leveraged, and it's also embodied what it's talked about. So, and your journey demonstrates that, right?
Yeah. Well, Will, thank you and Karis for initiating this podcast adventure. It's been such a pleasure and a joy doing it with you.
And look what our cultic journeys led us. We've unified.
Yeah.
We've unified our voices.
I know we've been so busy producing this show that we haven't really ever gotten to sit down to get to know each other that much. So it was great
I
to
know.
tell you a little bit about my religious spiritual journey that had some culty aspects throughout the whole time. And it's been great to chat with you guys about it. Thank you.
Well, also, I think too, it's important to, like, if there's a spiritual aspect to this, I would see it as we were all people at one point in our lives that wanted to do something positive and trusted, which is a positive thing and is what people should do. And we did that and trusted some people that led us astray, but yet we've all kind of come into this space together with that same intent, and we're aligned with the right people, following ourselves rather than something else.
Absolutely.
And we've learned to trust again.
You know, I didn't really bang on my trust that much.
Oh, it totally did for me.
I kind of lean
For
on
sure.
the, like, I give people the benefit of the doubt
I do too. Yeah.
unless they prove
Yeah.
otherwise. But I'm also just, I'm not that quick to let new people into my life anymore. I kind of have like my people, and I'm like,
I agree.
I don't really need that many new friends anymore.
No, there's not a lot of time
It's
either.
bandwidth.
Yeah, there's no
it's-
time.
It's bandwidth.
Thanks for producing A Little Bit Culty,
Yeah.
Will.
Well, we love you
Give
guys.
our love to Karis.
Thanks for having me on.
I know, man. This is,
We love you.
This is the
We love
journey.
you. Look at us.
We did it.
I know, it's great.
Married podcasters. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation.
I'm pretty sure they did.
I also want to put it out there that if you're listening to this and you're thinking, should I make a podcast? Should I do it on my own? Should I use one of those apps? You can make a podcast by yourself, or should I hire somebody? If you're thinking about it, really consider the team at Citizens of Sound. They did us a real solid by putting us on the right track with A Little Bit Culty. We just did what they said, you know?
And I spoke with someone tonight, actually. I was pumping your tires, Will.
And I think that what we're going to do for the bonus content for this is to post the video. I'm not sure where it will be. We'll post it either on Patreon or the Instagram feed of the day that we met Will Retherford in real life at South by Southwest, which is about a year ago, actually.
There's a handful of people, and I don't know if God sent them or angels sent them or whatever, but Will's one of the people that showed up in our lives when we were trying to turn this thing into a positive, and he's a huge catalyst for it. So it's an honor to be working with him and then meeting with him and then creating with him. So it's one of the things when I'm in tune with the universe, I appreciate it. Right, Ace? Ace, you want to say bye? Love you, Will.
Can you say love you, Will?
Love you.
Say thanks, Will.
You're my friend.
Yeah. Anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. Make sure to follow Citizens of Sound and follow us and go to Patreon and, all the things. Okay, I got to go put this kid to bed.
Sinking down to the depths.